All right. Welcome, everyone, to our panel, Mind the Gap, Funding Emerging Neurotech. I promise that we named this before we knew about the tube strike. So it was coincidental, but there is some synergies. Although we're not talking about the Piccadilly line, we're talking about neurotech founders. I would like to start the panel by really talking about why we do what we do in neurotech. I think we all know someone who's been affected by Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, the inability to speak, see, or move. And that really drives our work. We believe also that the opportunity to solve these issues is the moonshot of our generation. But it's not going to come without not only the funding gap, but the challenges, really a minefield of challenges across technical, clinical, and regulatory risk. But for the next 35 minutes or so, we're not just here to talk about the challenges, also aim to provide some insights. My name is John Propst. I'm a principal at Nexus NeuroTech Ventures. I've spent my career really building products all the way from prototype through engineering, design, and production validation. And I'm excited to announce my panel as well. Start with you, Amy.
Yeah. Thanks for coming out this afternoon during lunch. My name is Amy Kruse. I'm a neuroscientist by training, PhD in neuroscience, but I'm currently a venture investor. I'm a general partner at a venture fund called Satori Neuro, where we focus on mental health, brain health, and the application of neurotechnology. I put it under the larger umbrella of human flourishing. I also started out my career as a program manager at DARPA. So I've been working sort of at the intersection of high risk, high reward technology, particularly in neuroscience for 2 decades now. Thanks.
Great to be with you all. Bill Marks. I'm a neurologist by background, spent most of my career in academic neurology, focused on interventions for neurological disorders like neuromodulation, deep brain stimulation, gene therapy. More recently, I'm an investor at Nexus NeuroTech. We focus on helping those with brain disorders. Pretty much anything that's not a molecule is within scope for us.
Good afternoon. My name is Ibery. I'm an investor in medtech, specializing in neurotech in particular. I'm actually a humble neurosurgeon by background, having spent...
A humble neurosurgeon?
And starting out in NHS, it certainly is humble, Bill. And then I've gone to the dark side. I had a stint in Whitehall, where I was a policy advisor with Sir Bruce Keogh, who was head of NHS at the time as a medical director, including on reimbursements, specialist input, so on and so forth. But I've been an investor for the past decade or so.
Hey folks, I'm Jacques Carolan. I am a program director at ARIA. Originally an applied physicist, used to build like computer chips for a long time and then moved across into systems neuroscience. I'm probably a bit of an outlier on this panel. For folks who aren't familiar with us, ARIA is a UK-based R&D funding agency with the mission of really pursuing research into areas that seem speculative, but if true, would really be transformational on a global scale. So I'm leading the precision neurotechnology program there. So yeah, excited to be with you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our panel is going to be in 3 parts or so today, starting with some challenges. Then we'll move into how to get things done despite those challenges, and then we'll have a forward-looking section. So I'll try to keep this rowdy crowd on track. So to frame the discussion, I wanted to start with kind of a lightning round question. So in a few sentences, how do you describe the biggest barrier facing these early stage neurotech companies, and sometimes the barriers that they don't overcome? And we'll just go in order.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question, and I actually think, using the investor lens, but flipping it back from the early stage company perspective, it's actually been really challenging because we don't have a ton of big exits in this space. And so I think companies are always trying to come up with creative math to, kind of show how big opportunities are. And so I think that's actually one of the challenges that we've been facing. Hopefully we'll solve soon with some great outcomes, but I do think that's a challenge.
Yeah, I would say a lack of sufficient focus early on, exciting scientific ideas that are still a little diffuse, and therefore you're not really capitalizing on the efficiency that's needed for program and project and product development to actually develop a successful business.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think costs to develop some of these technologies as well in time to market is also quite significant as a barrier. And so is the regulatory complexity, especially when it comes to emerging markets where we see some of the biggest growth in terms of consumer uptake, but perhaps more on that later.
I can kind of speak from the government funding side. I think the big thing for me is don't be a tool looking for a solution. Like we see this all the time. You spend your career, your academic lab working on this widget, and you're just trying to find anywhere it can be useful. Really think about what that solution is, work back from there, span the space of possible technologies. I think that's really key.
I think that's a good point, Jacques. And you know, you're designed to fund things almost that are too risky for the private sector. So do you find, based on what you see, that the problem is a lack of attractive, ambitious ideas, or do you think the venture or private sector model is not set up to deal with the timelines and inherent risk associated with a neuro innovation?
Yeah, so I definitely don't think it's a lack of ambitious ideas. That's something that I've seen time and time again. There are these ideas here. I would just say they're probably a bit too early stage for either venture or for other even funding mechanism, public funding mechanism. And that's kind of my job. Right, my job, the unsexy part of my job, is to de-risk it for further follow-on funding, and to give you a sense of that within the program that we're running. So, the program that we established, this precision neurotechnology program, is based on the idea that many brain disorders, whether it's neurological, neuropsychiatric, are really disorders of circuits, of wiring. So, if we can go in and fix that wiring, potentially even have much more efficacious therapies. And we're funding a whole spectrum of different approaches towards doing this, right? From very early stage biohybrid approaches. Can you grow stem cell derived neurons and implant them in brains as a neural interface, right? That's definitely not ready for venture yet. That's super early stage. And then we have a little bit further down the line. So often when I speak with companies who maybe have got Series A funding, they've got the thing they need to work on because they got venture funding, and then they got the thing they really want to work. And actually, just a few £1 million can often unlock that. So, for give an example, we're working with a company called Motif, which Amy knows very well, and their initial product is a kind of skull implantable transcranial magnetic stimulation device. We've funded them to say, can you miniaturize that and have multiple of these nodes to both record brain states, figure out when it goes to a pathological state, and then drive the brain to a new state? And they're actually partnering with a ASIC designer in the UK to really drive down and miniaturize that system. So hopefully it gives you a sense of the spectrum of areas that we work in.
Definitely does. And Bill and Nick, you're both clinicians and investors. So you live at this, speaking of medical possibilities, you live at this intersection of what's possible medically and the financial realities. We see founders that come to us with really interesting, novel, even peer-reviewed science sometimes. So how do each of you decide what makes an investable business?
Well, you mentioned starting with great and novel science. That's a good place to start. But I think the problem is in the translation. How do you translate that science into something that is both useful and used? And in terms of being useful, I mean, I always look at what is the problem that's trying to be solved? What's the unmet need? Is the need big enough? Because a lot of times we see these kind of niche kind of approaches that when you step back, you're just not solving a big enough problem.
Right.
And then if you are trying to solve a big problem, what will be the magnitude of the impact of that intervention? Because at least at our firm, we're less interested in incremental kinds of progress, but things that are truly going to make a difference. So that's the, is it going to be useful? And then is it going to be used? Because there are a lot of useful things that people just don't want to use because it's too challenging. It doesn't embed readily into a clinical workflow. It's tricky though, because if we're focusing only on the status quo, then how do we disrupt things? And yet, as I think somebody mentioned, medicine and the clinical world and the scientific world is very slow to change. So there is that balance. Are people going to use it?
Yeah, I completely agree with those comments. And just to build on that, I think it also depends on kind of lens you look through in terms of making those decisions. Now, I mean, we could easily argue that there is no real tension in terms of making a difference, making an impact to patients' lives, moving that needle on that, as well as making right returns if you are an investor. But I think tension comes in and complexity comes in when it comes to timeframes and also your investment discipline. And there, we're lucky to have likes of yourself, likes of Nexus, who can take different kinds of risk as opposed to a standard, say, 10-year plus 2 LPGP structure, or it did some variation on that. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all, but we know some of these technologies to come to life and to really deliver on what they need to deliver, full potential, could take longer, let's put it mildly. But at the same time, fundamentals are very interesting. We've seen huge amounts of growth in neurotech, never mind on a market side in terms of the demand side, and there are specific drivers for that. Fundamentals are heading in the right direction. There's lots of investor interest in this area, whether it's a risk capital or government type of capital, and there's a role for whole spectrum.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Amy and Jacques, I think, especially at the seed stage of very early, sometimes the team can almost be more important than the tech, dare I say.
Yeah.
So what's the most common team-related mistake that you see these very early stages make? Because really, it requires a founder that's really pretty special, a scientist and an operator. And would you prefer almost to invest in a brilliant scientist who needs to learn business, or a scientist who needs to hire a business?
Oh, I do think it can be tough for folks that are true academics to learn business in a fast enough sort of manner. When it comes to team, I'm definitely looking at a CEO or a founder that knows what their strengths are and knows what they need to add to the team, and at the same time doesn't overhire, right? So I think their real, sense of awareness of what their skill set is. It is a rare, I would say, it's been my experience in neurotech, it's a rare founder that makes the transition like straight out of academia into entrepreneurship. It tends to be a little bit of a longer journey unless they're really ready to go. And I've met a couple founders that are really, sort of like that. You can see it right away. But I do think it's really important for folks to know what strengths they have, what they need on the team, not overhiring. And yeah, just really, we say this, like investors say this all the time, and I don't want to make it be a cliche, but like someone that you can partner with, someone that's coachable. Like, I love to work with my founders and CEOs in a like very creative, open, strategic sort of way. I think founders should look for investors that are true partners, because that will be, we're all just working on this as we go, right? These are hard problems and hard things to bring to market. So I think that partnership is something from both sides that I look for.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then one of those unique founders we're both invested in, Don at AMPA. Yeah. So it's special to see.
Yeah, it is really special to see.
And Jacques?
On the team side, it's an interesting one, because we're like, as a government funding agency, we're trying to get people to do really hard things in really short periods of time. And we're kind of on their ass. We meet with them every quarter. We get technical updates. That's not for everyone. All right, but that's essentially how we de-risk it. So we've got a hard problem, which is trying to understand beforehand if people's incentives are aligned, right? Like, is it the case you've just been building this material your entire career, and if it's not the right one, well, this project isn't for you? Or is it the problem that keeps you up at night, that you're completely obsessed with? It's probably similar for the types of things that you folks look into. And something that's pretty unique is we can actually meet with our teams before we decide to fund them. We can see what those team dynamics are. Give you an example. we actually set up a teaming platform in advance of our funding call where folks could meet who maybe had complementary skill sets. And a bunch of folks met and we interviewed them, and we'd basically given a bunch of strangers a month to put together a £7 million proposal. And they were like, it was across different continents, time zones. They were meeting late. It was like hard, but it brought them together. And we really got a sense of that from this first call. And it's going incredible. So I think the things we look for are very similar to things that the other folks in this room also look for.
That's awesome. I love that model with almost cross-functional, because it does take a village, right? And people see things from a different lens. Whereas if you're ingrained or trained in a certain area, you might not see things that are cross-functional.
Right. And I do think that's one of the interesting things about neurotech in general. I do think it's quite cross-functional. Right. Just the things we're talking about, the clinicians, the neural engineers, the, everything from software to hardware to supply chain to, there's a lot of complexity in neurotech and interfacing with the brain. And so I think that's, one of these things that we're looking for as we look for teams and things as they come together that Jacques, you've seen. But that ARIA is very special in the fact that they can incentivize and bring those multidisciplinary teams together, which is sort of one of the best things about those structures.
Yeah. Along those lines, one of the things I love to do is to visit companies. And I think people don't do enough of that to really see the teams in action, their working environment, their style. It's really quite eye-opening in both directions. Sometimes I really was skeptical, and then, man, the team is firing on all cylinders, right?
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Right. Sometimes they don't have an office.
Which is not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, I always find that it is a team, right? It needs to be the complementary skill sets, and then again, everything's already said in terms of the passion and there's a dedication. And we're quite lucky in neurotech in particular, but neurosciences in general. There's plenty of that, whether it's clinicians or investors or founders. But it's the test of challenges that I find the teams really show their colors. Yeah. And quite often when you see them struggle, whether it's the office issue or some macro issue or funding issue, and you squeeze them a little bit, not deliberately, but just the struggle. And that's when you see them either come together or disintegrate. And to me, that's one of the signals that I would actually look for. Now, again, I think your program is fantastic, by the way, and a very important role that you play, especially in the European ecosystem. Sorry, John.
But there is something special about the brain and who we are. And not to say that, people aren't dedicated to their stent or something. But, because it is so complicated, these neuropsychiatric conditions, people almost uniformly, I think, are really passionate about this and really mission-driven.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's kind of what we were talking about, is really believing this with advancements in technology, solutions to these neurodegenerative, neurodevelopmental, and neuropsychiatric problems really are more in reach than they have been, and really promise to be the moonshots of our generation. So it's exciting to have so many bright cross-functional minds working in the space. Okay, so we've talked about a handful of challenges, and now maybe we'll move on to the funding landscape and offer some pointers for the founders and investors in the room. We have the U.S. represented, but we also have the U.K. And Europe represented here. So, Jacques, you're here in London, and so how do you see geography coming into play when building a neurotech company in the UK and Europe versus the US?
Well, one thing that we, I think, have in buckets really is the talent part, right? Everyone always says this, is almost trite to say it. We have 3 of the top 10 universities in the world. There's a lot of talent, but you think about like neurosurgery. Neurosurgery was basically invented a few miles away over at Queen's Square. So we have this real core element. So I think talent is absolutely there. The regulation side, that's kind of complex. I think it's beginning to catch up to neurotech, and I think it'll take some time, but I'm actually confident we'll get there. The bit that's missing in my eyes, or the bit that needs growth, is the capital element. We kind of very early on at ARIA realized that, we're going to need to figure out this capital element. How do we, if we have these promising early signals, where's that off-ramp? How can we get venture interested in these projects? So I'll just give you a couple of examples. We actually put a call, a very broad call, open for what we called activation partners. So these are teams to really run alongside us and to build, capital inflows, new communities, new talent pipelines. And actually, we have a number of deep tech VCs based in the US, Pillar VC, 50 years, who are moving to the UK to actually run programs, fellowship programs in the spaces that we're working with. We're working with companies like, or organizations like Renaissance Philanthropy, really thinking about how we get philanthropic investment into this space as well. And then the final thing I'll mention, which is like less super exciting, but actually really important, is on the contractual side. We've actually limited the amount of equity the university can take in spin-outs that come out of things we fund.
That's interesting.
Really, so folks like this can actually get excited about it. So that we're trying to pull all these various levers. We still have some way to go, and it's an experiment. We'll see if it actually pans out.
Yeah, completely. And then, Nick, you recently published a report in the European, I believe it was the European Tech Investment Report, actually, and you
It's like,
you have got
referred to it, yeah. Shameless plug.
What's the cost of the subscription?
This is not a plug, but you do talk about the resilience, but then also some of the constraints that you see in the European startup ecosystem, but also the strength in health tech. And then you mentioned some headwinds about slower exits, less growth capital, which you touched on, Jacques, as well, and maybe more cautious on the early investment side. So how do you see investors valuing early commercial traction versus that longer regulated path?
Sure. So we have some macro trends, which I suspect many of you would be familiar with, but there are differentiating trends across the Atlantic. Obviously, apart from obvious abundance of capital and depth of capital markets in the US, we do have specific issues when it comes to macro and geopolitics that affects sort of European side of things. We did do a tech report, not biased, of course. I just contributed to some of the stats and help the team to pull everything together. But these are general trends in tech, not specific to neurotech or indeed medtech in general, but they are very telling. So this is the first half of 2025, and we could go back and compare trends or macro trends, if you like, in terms of funds raised, at what stage, as well as different parts of Europe, so on and so forth. But in a nutshell, there was quite a bit of optimism early this year in terms of what tech in general could do in Europe. And of course, Jacques, you're absolutely right. We do have the excellence of science that still prevails across European nations. I'm a bit biased, of course. I'm also based in the UK. And UK does and has been punching way above its weight. In fact, if you look at all monies raised across tech, almost quarter of all risk capital raised have been in the UK. It's 24.9 across different segments. Now, we are down from year before, not significant, but nonetheless, it's quite a signal. But we're particularly down on exits, and that's where we are seeing most of the challenges. And to go back to your point, John, we are seeing early stage risk capital, some diluted, some non-dilutive, but the pinch comes when it comes to one, true exits, i.e. strategics buying, and we can expand on that, the reasons for that, or indeed more mature capital when it comes to growth stage. So beyond, say, Series A, Series B, where we really lag behind in Europe. Now, many of you will be very familiar with that problem, but one picks that, why that's the reason, or why we're seeing those trends, especially impacting great science in Europe. Again, it's probably a separate conversation. And just to finish off, we had a huge amount of capital coming into neurotech. Of course, the sector's been beneficiary of not just different kinds of capital, but also the increased awareness. Of course, fundamentals in terms of tech, Bill knows this better than I do, things that are coming down the pipeline fundamentally are very, very important modalities. And that, I think, will prevail. And despite all these challenges, whether it's capital markets in Europe or the risk capital abundance or lack of, I should say, we're still seeing that positive trend. So we're hoping that later this year, notwithstanding some of those elements that I alluded to, we'll have a pickup again in those trends.
That's great. And then we talked about it's not a lack of ambitious ideas And Amy, this question is for you. So talking about the platform, and this came up at the beginning, talking about platform versus product, right?
Right.
The founders come to us with this, very innovative tech that could be applied across indications. But as seed investors, we really want focus.
Yeah.
And so how do you advise founders to resolve that tension? Do you prefer a focused seed pitch, not talking about a platform on multiple indications, or a bigger platform play?
I have to admit, I'm a platform gal. No, I mean, I think that's one of the most exciting and beautiful things about neurotech is that it has that potential, right? And so, it's not just, like you said, it's not just a stent for one, heart valve or whatever, right? It really covers all
Not
of
that
those.
there's anything wrong with that.
No, not that there's any.
We may all meet them.
I totally, I'm in. But I think, capturing the potential of neurotech as a platform, and then, again, working with the team, working with the founders, spending the time, I think, to think about what that first indication is, working with the KOLs, working with the clinicians, kind of doing the math. I do think that's an important part. And then maybe you have maybe 3 that are in a little bit of a horse race together, and maybe some early clinical evidence helps one pull ahead, or you have an incredible result in one. I think this is actually one of the most important roles of non-dilutive funding in startups. Referring back to what Jacques said, is this is the R&D. I do think non-dilutive funding is the R&D engine of startups. And so if you can focus, use that platform potential, but also give yourself a little room if you're able to access non-dilutive capital, which then could maybe let you do some early clinical partnerships with, universities, academic labs, other things. So I think there's a lot to work with in this space, but I do agree that, I think platforms are where it's at.
I mean,
That's just me.
I agree with that because, to your point, a lot of these neuropsychiatric disorders are circuit disorders, whether it's epilepsy, pain, depression, whatever.
Right.
So you can take a circuit approach. So it would make sense. It's certain tools that can probe those circuits and certain interventions that can intervene in those circuits. However, I will say it drives me a little crazy when I get the pitch deck where this is going to cure
everything,
generalized anxiety, insomnia, Alzheimer's disease, and then
sounds like psychedelic medicine.
Yeah, exactly. So it is that balance, and to pick something and go deep and do it well, right?
Yeah.
And just to build on Amy's point as well, I would say about 40% of the money we give out goes to industry. And often industry, the right aligned company is better better set to solve many of these problems. So actually, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Nick, you agree as well?
I probably should disagree, but I don't. So I have to say, like Bill said, you had things when you sort of see those, we're a platform, so we can basically, there's a difference between being a platform technology and being a sort of a spray and pray type of. That's what really we're referring to when it comes to some of those pitch decks. But what we are seeing a little bit more differentiation. Certainly amongst, again, I'm a bit biased, of course, but amongst investors, there is a little bit more depth and sophistication. I think there was quite a bit of excitement in the wake of pandemic years that followed when it comes to all things in tech in general, certainly all things in health tech, and of course the sectors that we are discussing today has been beneficiary of that. But I'm seeing that as that tide's gone out, seeing a little bit more scrutiny, a little bit more, and I think that's a good thing for the market. I think it's a good thing for investors, for sure, certainly for LPs, but it's a very good thing for founders and for technologies as well.
I actually think, and just to play on that, I think there's an interesting thing that's happening in the overall conversation around neurotech and particularly around brain-computer interfaces.
I wondered when that phrase is going to emerge.
Very hot topic.
If it's going to jump over, the transom, and we're starting to have these conversations around implantable or semi-implantable consumer brain. It's just we're in a very interesting moment.
Yeah, and maybe just like a meta point to that, one of the big areas we haven't spoken about yet, there's a huge amount of kind of crypto philanthropy that's going into this space.
Yeah.
Huge amounts of kind of very, high risk capital large amount. And again, regardless of whatever it's funding, that's not the point, but it's changing what people think of as possible.
Yes.
And I'm really fascinated in this.
Yes.
I'm really fascinated how maybe organizations like ARIA or focused research organizations or different types of entities are just allowing people to dream bigger than they have done before. Now, whether that actually translates into getting things in the clinic, time will tell. But I think it's a really interesting time.
Well, it's a very interesting time because if you think about where we were 5 years ago, like all of us have been doing this for a while, right? If you think about where we were 5 years ago, we were having conversations with people around implanted brain computer interfaces, and they think it's science fiction. You're like, no. Like the research part of this is actually worked out. We're actually working on the engineering part of it. Now I feel like we're in a different part of that conversation where people are like, oh, you're making the engineer, like, oh, we have humanoid robots. Oh, we have brain computer interfaces. So we have like, no, I think that whole conversation has shifted, and I think that's benefited neurotech. I think it's benefited some companies in neurotech more than others, but hopefully, kind of moves this whole front forward, which gets back to Nick's point about growth capital and coming in at these later stages.
And what really will be the first useful, scalable application? I'm not sure yet, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think there has been an uptick, to your point, in deep tech or big tech billionaires in this brain computer interface space, and there's some healthy skepticism about how fast can they accelerate beyond, because those of us in the space understand the clinical and
right, like you kind of have
scientific
to do the
story,
right? Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
So in terms of providing maybe some actionable advice, we're at an Emerging Medtech conference, so there's undoubtedly a founder in the room with prototype stage, maybe some promising preclinical data, prepping for a seed raise or actively raising now. So what are one or two key things that they must share with you early to really get your attention? Because it's also tough. You review all of these promising technologies to really not go further, right? So what's one or two things that they need to share with you early in the dialogue to have you dive in deeper for deep diligence?
I would say,
It's for everyone.
From my perspective, I'll start really understanding the landscape of what's already, like doing your homework, really understanding the landscape of what's out there, what's, even if other things are early, you really need to do that, because you have to remember that as investors, we sort of see everything. And so if you show up and you have the, 15th version of something and don't acknowledge that there are any other things, in development or in the market or whatever, that generally moves me back a step and says, this is something, someone who may not be realizing the context of what they're proposing this in. So I really do like to see a very cogent conversation around the landscape and why it's different, why it stands out. That's something like top of mind for me. There'll probably be others, but
yeah, I agree. And that landscape isn't only other tech solutions,
right,
but it may be drugs under development that are with shuttles that are getting into the brain where you may not need to open the blood-brain barrier with the tech solution, right? So what is the landscape? And honestly, in the previous AI session, they talked about now the, startups can use AI to do snazzy PowerPoints. And I don't actually want a snazzy presentation. I want clarity in outlining what's the solution, what's the problem that we're trying to solve. To your point, what else is out there? Right. Why is there an unmet need? And what is going to be the chain of evidence that needs to be created and the path to get this thing into the world?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And beyond competition, I think the substitutes, especially in the space we're in, it's really important to understand what you are competing against. And of course, the team and technology are being sort of obvious ones to cover off. But to me, that product market fit, really understanding your market and the patient pathways, that proximity and and knowledge that you can get there. Now, who knows, right? We are in a risk business, but you need to really do your homework. You need to understand that you've thought about it, you've done your due diligence, and you can speak intelligently about it and have a plan, actionable plan.
I'll just briefly mention, from the kind of ARIA perspective, you're applying there, I actually don't need to see preliminary data. Just like, can you just give me a really strong, compelling argument why your technology is differentially able to solve this problem in a way that nothing else can? That's what I want to see.
Yeah. I was going to add one more thing, and this has been something that's evolved over the last few years. And I think it's evolved in the biotech molecule space as well as in the neurotech space. There's just a higher and higher premium associated with early clinical data. Yeah. And so, whether you're able with your solution to do that it may not be possible, but what is your path to that? Are there other demonstrations or other things that can sort of get you close or a proxy of that? I think just from an investor perspective, we've really seen a premium on that. And
completely agree. And step 2 may even be more critical. Okay, now you've got a little bit of preliminary data.
Right.
What is the next logical?
Right.
In first in human, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just really changed, over the last few years. And so.
But that's a macro trend we're seeing across.
That's what I was saying. It's also in biotech.
And it's an interesting point, which we probably won't expand on now, why that's the case. Of course, there's a cyclicity there involved. There are strategics who are on the other side of that. And of course, that opens up that gaping hole that we referred to earlier in terms of growth stage and what's happening to the later stages of some of these excellent companies that are growing in Europe in particular.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, to bring us to kind of our last part of the panel, and maybe back to our title here, Minding the Gap. And again, I gave a disclaimer at the beginning. We didn't know about the tube strike. So I'd like to look ahead and perhaps get a bold prediction from each of you. What do you see? We talked about the moonshots of our generation. We talked about the advancements in technology being at this time very interesting for neurospace. What do you see as the largest unmet need in neuro and the corresponding opportunity to produce a breakout company in the next 5 years? This question is for everyone. So, Jacques, you look.
Maybe I'll go quickly first. I'm thinking now a lot about this kind of access. I think there's a huge gap between the people who can currently access state-of-the-art neurotechnologies and the potential that can help. So I'm really interested in whether there are technological solutions towards that problem. How far can we push non-invasive approaches? How can we get to the brain in new, novel ways through the vasculature, through the CSF? I think there's a huge amount of white space there, and I'm super excited. So we recently put a blog out on this on the ARIA Substack. So check it out and leave some comments. Yeah.
Anybody can jump, please.
Well, I can go next. I think previously a lot of what we were building our faith on was empirical evidence without really a fundamental understanding of what was going on. And I think we're finally have the tools, be it, functional imaging or magnetoencephalography or stereo EEG or new ways to decode the brain, understand those circuits, to then start to create interventions that are more likely to work with new modalities. I spent my career doing a lot of deep brain stimulation, but boy, it would sure be nice to do less deep stimulation. And through new modalities, ultrasound, low intensity ultrasound, photobiomodulation, as well as good old electricity delivered in different ways.
Yeah.
New approaches to match up with the underlying fundamental understanding of brain circuits, I think I'm excited about.
Yeah. And just to build on that, I think, I invest in both, med tech or tech and molecules. And what I love about neurotech is I really think it's going to give drugs a run for their money.
Yes.
Right. And so as I think about mental health, or I think about even neurodegenerative conditions, and I really think getting to this scale piece, getting to this circuit-based piece is what for me, really excites me and motivates me around what's happening in neurotech now. So. Yeah.
I think most of it has been covered, but including in that space, focused ultrasound in terms of drug delivery, brain barrier. Those are the kind of things that we tend, 5-6 years ago, science fiction. And I think neurotech is where cardiovascular was 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago. It's a really exciting time for us, but of course we are all biased.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place for us to end. So I think a clear message was neurotech is a team sport. So let's all roll up our sleeves. And then really a new level of collaboration between public and private capital.
Absolutely.
So thank you all for your
Thanks for having us.
for your
Thank you,
wow,
John.
insight.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yeah, John. Thank you.
Be sure.